Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm Jon Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer. And on this podcast, I'm here to try to help you write an amazing fantasy novel or fantasy short story. I love the fantasy genre. I think it's a wonderful genre to write in, but it's a really hard genre to write in for many reasons, and it's an even harder genre to try to publish in. Now, maybe you're a beginner, maybe you're a barbarian, maybe you're somebody who wants to write a fantasy novel, but you're not quite sure where to start. Maybe you read a lot of fantasy and you're wondering, hey, why isn't there better fantasy coming out? Or at least fantasy that aligns with my taste a little bit more than what I'm currently reading. Well, I won't be able to help you with all of your questions, but really my goal is to try to help make sense of where you're at in your journey, especially if you're in the middle of the drafting process and you just want to get your feet wet writing a good fantasy novel, something that you're proud of. That's really what I'm here to do for now. Now, part of the process of this podcast is quite simple. I take a look at fantasy prompts, writing advice prompts, to be more specific, from aspiring fantasy writers. I take a look at these prompts for the first time, actually. I haven't read these ahead of the recording. So you're getting my unscripted reactions and advice. Without further ado, let's take a look at today's fantasy prompt, and at the end, we'll have our producer, Bridget Surdock, provide any fact checks or clarifications, if needed, that I can provide on air. This prompt we're getting today comes to us from producer Natalia Emmons. She found this for me in the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. And as usual, Natalia also reaches out to the people who write these prompts and lets them know that we're doing this podcast so they are aware and they can listen in if they're curious or they want to know what I have to say. So hopefully that's been helpful for people. Okay, here's the prompt. It is from user Rare Looms. I like that username. It's kind of fun. Rare Looms puts here, okay, how to decide if you're doing too much world building, exposition, and lore for the sake of character development? ? I find myself getting stuck writing lengthy exposition, building my world, adding the usual plot settings and character development, and trying to be profound with my characters' lore, habits, and behaviors. Then I realized the next day that I wrote a lot of nothing, and the average person would never sit through and read all this. I would because I'm the writer who enjoyed explaining it all in great detail. I found myself making the first few paragraphs about my characters finding and interacting with a pet that will be with them throughout the entire chapter. It was not essential to the plot, only character development and moral support. Now I'm deleting all this, making them find the pet, be in awe, and directly move on to progress the plot while fleshing out the pet's character. I don't want to keep making this mistake. How do I stop it once and for all? So there are so many things to this, and I have actually touched on a few of these things before. This idea of really what you should do before you actually draft the novel. And one thing that I'm a firm believer in is writing a lore letter. And what that is actually, you know what, I should start with this. I'll be a little personal. For me, when I've written hyper ambitious fantasy stories, something that I've done in the past is I will write detailed backstory. I'll write an in-world history textbook, to borrow a phrase from a previous episode. But the idea is you're writing the wiki, you're writing basically George R. R. Martin's A World of Ice and Fire, but it's, before you actually draft the novel. And what you're trying to do is you're just trying to, in some ways, maybe discovery write, pants write, a bunch of backstory, mythology, and rules and things. And what typically happens for me when I've done this sort of thing in the past is, you're never going to guess this, I end up not using most of it. I end up changing a lot of it. And on the one hand, it's a fun exercise. It's an exercise that just kind of helps maybe bring some ideas to the forefront that do stick. So it's not a worthless process whatsoever. But I know that over time, I realize that, I don't have to stick to all this. I can use it as a basic blueprint. Not really, though. Maybe not blueprint is the right words, because I'm not really building anything specific with it. It really is just more of like a mood board at the end of the day. I'm creating a bunch of things that feel like they could go into the novel, but I always allow myself to have the creative freedom and flexibility to change a lot of things. And you know what? That also applies to character development, which I know they're bringing up here. So all that to say, I really like lore letters. And what a lore letter is it's more centered around two things. fleshing out your character, which Rare Looms is kind of bringing up here, but also fleshing out the world at the same time. So rather than writing it as, in the beginning, the world of Astafar was made up of 3 provinces, instead, I write it as a letter from the main character. So it would start with, my name is Joshana of Astafar. My homeland was destroyed 300,000 years ago, and now my people wander for... So I put some personality into it. And that's helpful for me because then I start to find little things about the character because it's the main character talking about this stuff. Now, I like to keep the lore letter short. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But this is helpful because it's doing 2 things at once. And that's always been such a beautiful, wonderful, always do this writing hack, which is in your writing, especially in fantasy, your scenes, your conversations, your set pieces in your novel should always be doing more than just one thing. So, for example, have you ever been writing your novel and you've been looking at the chapters and everything and you're like, okay, so the point of this chapter is I need to get these characters out of the city, right? So you write up a scene of like, okay, here is a chase scene or maybe them infiltrating the train station and they have to be, kind of quiet and quick about it. Now, that's a functional scene. It'll do its job, right? They'll get to the train station, they'll infiltrate, and then they do it. They manage. They get in the train, they get out of the city. But the scene needs to do more than that. It needs to do 2 things at least. If you can do 3 or 4 things, that's even better. But you'll notice, for example, in books and in like movies, they are always trying to put as much information or as much plot progression as they can into these scenes. So getting into the train station, well, the problem is that the main character has to trust the bad guy who was a bad, but now they're unwittingly having to help the hero. And this kind of villainous anti-hero, maybe antagonist, what have you, they have to trust that this person is going to get them through the train station. And so we get a little bit of information of maybe what this antagonist can do that's sort of surprising. We get a little bit of trust between the 2 characters, and you get out of the city. Right? So this is a little writing trick. I don't even want to call it a trick. It's just a tool. It's just an approach, a strategy. It's a way of making your story just feel a little bit more deep and layered. It's the sort of thing that gets you to keep turning the page. Because if it's just functional, if it's just moving through the world and things happening, and as Rare Looms kind of brings up the thing with the pet, I think that they are maybe dabbling in this a little bit because they say they're interacting with a pet and all of that. Well, whether or not you get rid of that whole thing, I think that you need to find really helpful or substantial additions to that interaction that are going to really stick out to the reader and make them invested. It should be about more than one thing, is all I'm trying to say. So bringing it back to Rare Loom's whole thing here, the thing that this makes me think of, and I'll probably do a lot more material on this on a future episode, is that I think that it's difficult to look at a book as a bunch of chapters. I don't like looking at a book as chapters back to back. I think a book is about scenes. Scenes are worth their weight in gold. Sometimes a scene is a chapter. Sometimes a chapter is 2 scenes or what have you. And if you can write a good scene, you can write a good book. That, in my opinion, and honestly, I think that that's been proven out. Now, what I'm seeing here is that you have a scene where characters are interacting with a pet. And maybe the reason you're deleting this is because you're just seeing that, yeah, it's a fun scene to read, but it doesn't ladder into the right part of your book. There are a lot of folks, readers in particular, who complain, especially about fantasy these days, modern fantasy, that a lot of these books start in the wrong place. And what we're seeing a lot is that authors will try to use their first chapter or a prologue or something to, like I said before, serve a very specific purpose. Maybe it's setting the world building, the atmosphere. They're trying to put in some stakes early on, but it doesn't feel like that's where the story truly begins. And one really helpful thing to do is to just cut through a lot of that material and just start the story. Trust that your reader is going to stay along with you and that they're going to absorb the world building details and the character development as they go. And in terms of what Rare Looms is getting at here too, in terms of like, I don't want to keep making this mistake. Well, I don't think you're necessarily making a mistake because I think writing that scene probably helped you out a lot more than you know, even if you're deleting it. And I hate deleting my material too, don't get me wrong. but it's there. It's still in your brain. I would still keep it in your notes because you never know when it might kind of pop up again or perk up again. And think of it this way too. Deleting this sort of thing and having to do all that, it's sad, but you know what? You are opening yourself up to even better material. You are giving yourself space to keep writing, and don't look at it as I have to kill my darlings necessarily, which I get. I always say that, but think of it more of like, I can't wait for the next thing I write that's going to be even better. And the more you delete in your story like this, the more opportunities, the more chances, the more space you're allowing for even better ideas. It's a more optimistic way to look at it. And again, not everybody wants to be optimistic, but that truly is my advice. I would say trust yourself that you're going to keep getting better at this. And the next thing you write, chances are pretty high that it's going to be even better. So don't count yourself short in that way. Now, the question here too, it's interesting because I feel like the prompt wasn't really about what I think the question was setting the expectation for in my mind. It was like how to decide if you're doing too much world building, exposition and lore for the sake of character development. That's kind of a different thing from what I think they're talking about. I think, they did talk about how they get rid of this scene because they just want to keep things moving. I think that obvious rule of thumb with world building and exposition is to look at the rhythm of your story and try to use a highlighter if you can, whether it's with a pen and paper or if you are highlighting with the word software, whatever it is. Highlight the sections of your text that are nothing but exposition and world building, and then highlight the text that progresses the plot and analyze it. Be very self-aware and self-editing with this sort of thing and pinpoint the areas where you're feeling like, wow, I did like 3 paragraphs in a row that were almost totally just exposition. I mean, sure, you might have broken up dialogue here and there, but it was just, this is something that I always have to do because I fall into the trap. Everyone does, for the most part. You'll just notice that like when you're in the writing flow, you will just keep going and going and you'll want to explain something and you'd be like, oh, I should explain that too because I didn't explain that. And this is where editing mode comes in. Write the chapter. Don't get me wrong. Write the chapter, write the scene, but then go back and see, all right, you know what? I don't need to explain this right here. I need a cut because I just want the reader to get through this stuff faster. And so that is a very crucial tip. It's the sort of thing that if you're trying to get published, if you're trying to query agents for representation, it's something that agents really have their eyes ready to see is, okay, how much exposition is in this thing? Is this writer crafty enough in the early goings especially to make world building feel fluid and organic to the story rather than, oh my gosh, this is just an entire page of you explaining to me what the inside of a house looks like. I do not care. And it's tough because you care because you're the author, it's your work, but you always just have to be a little bit self-aware, right? Of, okay, what are readers though going to think? What if I, was reading somebody else's work and it was like this? I would probably struggle a bit, right? And I get it. It can be tough, but beta readers can help with this as well. They can kind of help maybe show you like, maybe this seemed like it was exploding on the page for you, but for me, I got a little bit bored here and I wish we had gotten to this part faster because this part's really good and really interesting. Honestly, when I give advice or when I work with my like beta readers or I'm a beta reader for somebody, a lot of the time I literally will pinpoint, hey, this sentence over here, this sentence, start the novel with this sentence. I know it's on page 5, but this is where the story should start. I think that, in my opinion, of course, and I never want to be bossy or anything like that, but I do want to be opinionated because that is, that's one thing that if you're opinionated when you're giving feedback to other people and you do it in the right way, you do it constructively, politely, and kindly, and of course you are being fair, then I think what you'll find is like, even if they don't take your advice, they're going to at least trust that when they bring you some pages, you're going to give your honest, unfiltered feedback. And that is absolutely, truly, unbelievably valuable because a lot of folks, they won't. They will just kind of be like, oh yeah, that was good. I liked it. And that's unfortunately not very helpful. So hopefully that helps, Rare Looms. I think that I hopefully got to what you were asking, but let's take a look at some of the comments here and maybe that will also help round out what we're talking about even more. So this is from commenter Ibargüengoy Tia Miguel. Oh, it's Spanish, and I just butchered that, so apologies. I'll just say Miguel. As a general rule, especially for an amateur, everything you write should have a purpose. That purpose does not have to be advancing the narrative, but it should connect to the narrative. Character development is good, world building is good, and establishing tone is good. However, it should all be in some way relevant to the narrative. It doesn't have to be deeply and profoundly relevant, but still relevant. With time and practice, you get a better sense of how to balance all of these elements. So I basically agree with Miguel here because, yes, the overall thing that Miguel is saying is true, which is that it needs to connect to the narrative. The only caveat I will say is that you're not always going to judge what is relevant to the narrative in a good way. I've noticed this from my own work. Sometimes I will tell myself, I'll lie to myself, quite honestly. Like, well, this connects to the narrative because it shows us that the main character is caring and kind. They're going to save the cat. And so that's going to come into play later. Look, you might be right about that. That might be totally valid. But here's the thing. Even if that feels right to you, it probably in the moment as the reader is experiencing it, probably isn't going to pick up on that. And they're probably going to feel like this thing is meandering. I don't really get the point. And they're not even going to make it to the part where the character's kindness and caringness and all that stuff is going to come into play. So making everything have a purpose is very, very true, but you got to make sure that as you're reading it, that purpose is clear. And if it's not clear, there needs to be a little layer of mystery and inquiry so that the reader, like little clues and hints that show the reader like, here's a little conflict where it's not just that the main character saved the cat, but the main character almost didn't save the cat. Maybe there was a little bit more of like like they thought about not saving the cat because it was a little bit too inconvenient. So now you're setting it up that like this person is caring and kind up to a point, and they seem to be shaken about that. That is the thing that gets you turning pages, because then I want to know, well, what if they get faced with another test? What if something comes their way that's even more difficult? It's not just saving the cat, but saving a person. Now I kind of want to know. I want to keep going with the story. So that is an example of a purpose that has purpose, right? So yeah, just make sure you don't lie to yourself. And if you see something where you're like, okay, maybe I'm not presenting the narrative in the most relevant way that I can. So hopefully that's helpful. And I appreciate the comment there from Miguel. This is from Thomas Fowler II, who said, or they're responding to what Rareloom said about how a reader will never, sit through and read all this, the backstory and all that. I would, because I'm the writer who enjoyed explaining it all in great detail. And then this commenter, Thomas Fowler II, Fowler said, I think that's called a first draft. And then a smiley face. Seriously, though, the first draft in a lot of cases can help you to work out what the story is for yourself. The second, third, etc. drafts are the ones you make palatable and comprehensible for people who are not you. My note on this, I would say, I don't think that your first draft should have a lot of this stuff either. I know I was talking before about how you go back and you find, there's too much exposition, but I think also, that could be wrong, but I think Rare Looms is really also talking about like a more detailed, like bunch of pages of lore and all this stuff. But I think that you should try to avoid that being part of the story, because the problem is, as you're writing a fantasy novel, and especially if people who are listening who have actually gone through the process and written a lot already for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or more fantasy novels, is that it gets hard to keep track of all this stuff in your brain. And it gets hard to keep track of what's already been explained in the novel. So in many ways, it's actually a little bit better to leave stuff out, because then when you go back through, that's when you can explain things, especially as people are like, I didn't totally understand what this works. Can you fill in some more detail there? That is going to be a lot more helpful, because otherwise what ends up happening is you write a lot of backstory and lore and all this, and then maybe you unfortunately repeat it. And I did that in my most recent novel. I did it intentionally, and beta readers called me out, and they were like, you keep explaining this over and over again, but you don't need to. And I'm like, I know. I'm explaining it over and over again because I'm worried that people aren't going to get it. And then my beta reader, kindly was like, trust your reader. They're gonna keep track. You don't have to say it too many times. I'm like, you're right. So I had to take that lesson to heart myself. But it's easier to go back and insert things than it is to go back and be like, oh shoot, did I explain this already? I don't remember. I might have brought it up in the second chapter. And you're just adding so much extra time and work for yourself that you probably don't need to. Thomas Fowler also added here, not sure that you can really, this is in reference to Rare Loom said, I don't want to keep making this mistake. How do I stop it once and for all? And so this was in regards to deleting the whole scene with the pet. And yeah, Thomas Fowler says, not sure that you can really. And it may also be a necessary stage for you to iron out the kind of problems that are hard to predict when you first sketch out the plot and structure. That said, perhaps more time spent planning before writing might help. For instance, if you're writing to a limit of about 60,000 to 80,000 words, the number of words alone are going to help you realize that you need to be more judicious about what you spend time writing about. Maybe think of each word as $1 or euro, pound, gold piece, etc. Do you really need to spend $4,000 to $5,000 describing a cat? If you decide it is worth $4,000 to $5,000, what is it about the cat and or its description that make it worth the investment? So yeah, I definitely agree with what Thomas Fowler is saying here. I think this is pretty spot on, especially so that first part is kind of what I was saying too, like sometimes you are going to make that mistake and that's okay if you do. It sucks, but it's going to happen. You're going to write stuff that's just not going to make the cut and you're going to have to delete. And like I was saying before, the next thing you write is going to be even better. Chances are high, at least, that that'll be the case. And I also agree that yes, as I have mentioned on a previous episode, I think it was episode 2 of this podcast, I talked quite a lot about the planning and the stuff that you do before you're actually writing. And I do love that Thomas Fowler brings up the word count stuff because that also is a huge, huge part of my outlining process. I didn't even get into it actually, but I think of it as not just word count, but percentages. So if you recall from episode 2, I talked about how there's like a list of questions that you should try to ask yourself about your novel before it's part of the outlining process, but they're questions like, why do you want to write the book? How many perspectives do you want to, or point of view characters do you want to do? One of those questions, I don't think I brought up was, what's your ideal word count? How many words do you want this novel to be? That's actually really crucial. I'm surprised I left it out. But word count is so important because word count is going to tie back to how easy or difficult it is going to be to get an agent to represent you, but then also for a publisher to buy in and be like, yeah, I can sell that book. The reason being, fantasy tends to be on the higher side of word count because we need those extra words. We have these complicated worlds and fantasy concepts to explain. It takes more words to do that. So people expect fantasy to be a little bit longer. And readers, for the most part, readers are okay with a fantasy book being longer than thrillers and suspense. It's kind of part of the package. You want to escape. You don't want it to be too short, right? That said, there is a very, very delicate balance. Now, if you're just planning to self-publish and do ebooks, this isn't as big of an issue. Or, it could be an issue in terms of the story being too long for the reader and the pacing being wrong. But in terms of maybe you wrote an amazingly paced book, it just happens to be 150,000 words. That is possible. Well, when it's an ebook, it's not as big of a deal. But when it is a book that you want to be printed out, that you want people to buy, that you want to sign for people, and you want it to be traditionally published, well, word count then becomes extremely important because then your word count really determines whether or not how expensive the book is going to be. And that plays into whether or not the publisher feels like they can make a profit. And yeah, if that is your goal, if your goal is to be traditionally published, then word count is going to be crucial. You're going to have to be pretty judicious with your word count, to borrow a word from this Thomas Fowler commenter person. And one thing that, that kind of helps with this, it changes all the time, but typically that's why I asked the question of what kind of fantasy is it? Now, if it's epic fantasy, you know what? It's a little bit more expected. You're making it harder for yourself. You're going to have to work hard to make it right. But all right, people expect epic fantasy to be somewhere between 110 to 130,000 words. 130 is really on the high side, though. And you might be like, excuse me, Jon, slow down. This fantasy book I read from a debut author was 160,000 words and they got it published. Well, guess what? You are not that author. And if you think that you are going to be the exception to the rule, power to you, but that is a very unlikely event. And yes, that it may be the case that this fantasy author in their first book managed to query agents with a book that was 160,000 words and a publisher took them up on it. However, you are not that person. That is not your book. And so you should try to really break as few rules as you can because you want to set yourself up for success, just saying. Now, that said, you might be like, well, the book has to be this. Okay. That is, in your case, you're accepting the risks and there's nothing wrong with that. But you just have to be realistic and determine that, all right, if the things don't work out, at least I know why. At least I know what kind of was getting in the way there. All that to say, typically word count, and I'm going off on a tangent about this, but word count, for fantasy, it depends on the kind of fantasy it is. I don't know what kind of fantasy Rare Looms is writing here, It could be a fantasy that is, YA, for example. So it might be closer to the 80,000 to 100,000 words. They might be writing an adult fantasy, like, an urban fantasy or something. So like 100,000 to 105,000 might be right. Whatever it is, the point really is that they need to look at what the word count is ahead of time and what they want to do and what they think will work. And then when you actually go through the structure of the novel itself, and you start going through, like, here's the first act, here is this entire, part 2 of the novel, whatever it is, then you should start looking at it as percentages. And so there's a whole process to this. Michael Haig has a 5-act story structure that you can look into that's really helpful for this sort of thing. But basically, you should look at it as, all right, if I am 20,000 words into my novel, I said that I was going to do this for my word count. That means that I'm not good at math, but like I'm 10% into the novel and I haven't done my inciting incident. That is a huge issue. And that's the kind of thing that can help you figure out, like, yeah, I need to be editing a little bit more here. I need to be cutting to the chase here, deleting things. And yeah, to Thomas Fowler's point, the earlier you do this, the easier, because then you're not going to be as partial to that writing. It's not going to be as polished. It's a lot harder to delete scenes and to delete a lot of material out of your book when you only just wrote them, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I wrote this 6 months ago. I've revised it. I've edited it. Other people have seen it. I've worked so hard on it, and now I have to delete it. That's really the thing you want to avoid. You want to set yourself up so that you're only deleting stuff that, like, oh yeah, I wrote that last week, and that's okay. I can, maybe keep it in my notes folder or something if I want to refer back to it, because there were a couple of nuggets in there that were cool, but it's okay. I can just delete that. It's going to be so much easier, right? As opposed to, I'm going to, toward the end of this book, realize that, like, I have to cut because my book that I said was going to be 100,000 words. Now it's 140,000 words. So now I got to go back and I have to delete entire things. Nah, you don't want to have to do that, because chances are you have already edited it quite a bit and you spent a lot of time. And so, yeah, that's really where this stuff can get super dicey. So I appreciate Thomas Fowler's look at it. And the dollar thing, like, I've never thought of it that way. I don't know if that would work for me as well. I think it depends on how you view money and all of that. I think for me, like, $4,000 to $5,000 is such an abstract term that I don't know if this process would work for me necessarily, but I can imagine a lot of other people it would, because a lot of other people maybe would be, view money differently than I do, and that could be very helpful. So I like that tip, because that could kind of be more helpful for some other folks who, yeah, are just, their mind works differently. So yeah. All right, let's do one more comment before we call it. This is from Educational AD8138. And Educational said, my aunt told me something to help me with that. And then they put in brackets, why are you telling me this? What is the context? And so I think what they're trying to say, the reader might be asking that. Like, the reader is reading and they're like, okay, why are you telling me this? What is the context? Okay. But Educational goes on to say, but in all, fantasy can have a bit of this and that. Just do not get stuck into a rabbit hole. Give it meaning or shorten it down helps me a bit. I'm a bit of a nub at this, just saying. Yeah, I think that this is kind of what I was saying before. You want to get in your reader's head, right? Readers are going to be asking tough questions. Sometimes it can feel like you are the harshest critic of your book. And that's true. You are going to be harsh, but not always. You're a complicated person. You're nuanced. You're going to sometimes look at stuff and not be that harsh of a critic, because it's going to make sense in your head, right? It's going to be vivid in your head, because when you wrote it, you were probably imagining and picturing it. But sometimes your readers are not going to have nearly as vivid a picture as you. Sometimes they might, which is really cool, but you can't count on that. that typically is just a happy accident when that gets to happen. But yeah, you have to constantly be thinking like your reader. This is why it's helpful to read your novel aloud, for example. A lot of folks will advise to do this when you are editing, because when you read it aloud, you are reading it in a different way and you're getting closer to how somebody else would be reading this for the first time. This is also why beta readers are so helpful, because they're going to pick up on the things that you just won't. You've read this and edited it so many times. There are going to be little things that just you never would have thought of, right? That they're like, hey, this logic doesn't make sense because you said this character was sitting down and now over here, they're in a totally different part of the room. That's the sort of thing that's going to really help. Now, in terms of the context of the broader question of like the meaning, the purpose and all of that, yeah, this typically, if you give your novel or your excerpt or whatever it is to somebody else and they're asking things like, or they're bringing up things, or like, yeah, this part felt slow. or I was a little bored during this part. Usually the translation for that, what they're really saying, is that they weren't really sure what the point was. Why am I reading this? Why are these characters interacting with a pet? And again, that goes back to, well, if part of the interaction with the pet brings up a moral crisis, it brings up something kind of peculiar about the main character that has you intrigued because you're like, oh, I wonder why they had this thought or why they behaved this way. This feels a little unusual. Or, maybe it brings up something interesting about the dynamic in the friendship group that makes you think, why are these people friends? There's something kind of peculiar about what's going on here. Something seems off. And then you turn your reader from sort of a passive reader into an investigator. And them reading the book is like searching for clues. I like to think that basically every novel should in some ways be a mystery novel. Because really, the reader wants to know what happens at the end of the book, don't they? And you want the mystery to be enticing, and you want to bring up the point of the mystery as early on as possible. So that could be a very healthy way to look at it. Now, I know some people might say, well, Jon, this book isn't a mystery. Look at it. I'm sure there are plenty of exceptions, but I think for the most part, most books have some air of mystery to them. Even at the most basic, I don't know what the ending is going to be. I don't know how things are going to turn out. The mystery is something that I want to learn. The only way I'm going to find out what's going on here is if I keep reading. And so you have to entice people. You have to make the mystery of it enticing. And so that's why I think a lot of people undercount why Harry Potter, for example, or what made Harry Potter so successful, because a lot of people will be like, well, it's the characters, it's the magic stuff, and I don't want to get into the J.K. Rowling stuff and all that drama, but just to speak on of like why that series took off the way it did, I think a huge part of it that doesn't get discussed a ton is that those are mystery novels. If you think about like each Harry Potter novel, I mean, they bring up like a big mystery, and a lot of the excitement and the action and all that comes into these students are trying to figure out what's going on, and the reader is trying to figure it out along with them. That's kind of what makes you feel like Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They feel like you're friends because they're in the dark as much as you are. And Rowling, for all of her personal faults, she was very good at making sure to really make it feel like the main characters weren't always super ahead of you, the reader, and that they also could keep up with the reader. It was a very delicate balance. But yeah, if you take a look at those novels, Sorcerer's Stone, the whole thing was like, who is trying to bring Voldemort back? It was a little bit of a who's who. Chamber of Secrets, very similar. Like, why are these students, who's doing this to these students? Why is this happening to these students? And so on and so on. It's over and over again. That's probably why, like, the last book, it's not my favorite one in terms of like how, because like Deathly Hallows really is just like, where are the Horcruxes? It's not as like enticing a mystery, but we don't have to relitigate Harry Potter. I'm not in the mood to do that. So anyway, that'll do it for this one. And hopefully that was helpful for Rare Loom. And I'm not sure if there were a lot of other comments in here. I think we're reading this one pretty soon since it was posted. So I don't think there are a ton of comments yet. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to our fact checker, Bridget Surdock, wonderful producer Bridget Surdock, who is going to make sure I did not say anything too wrong, or that I can clarify anything if I misspoke or if something I said was confusing. I guess you could think of Bridget as sort of my beta reader in this case. A beta reader for a podcast. What a concept. So, all right, I will be back in a second. Okay, I'm back, and we have some extra notes here from producer Bridget. And Bridget took a listen, and this is one of my favorite parts of the show, honestly, because I get an extra chance to make sure that I'm making sense, which is definitely helpful for a lot of people, I'm sure. So Bridget said, doing a lore letter is such a good idea for a fantasy novel, or really any novel where you're completely creating the world, so that all your lore and characters and whatnot can be found in one place for your reference. TV shows do this all the time with show Bibles, just this massive document with all the necessary information to make the whole thing read the same from start to finish. I do this with my Dungeons & Dragons campaign. I have a campaign Bible that is a living document that me and my players edit as we go with necessary information, which does mean I need a separate one for myself for all the secrets I keep from them. Yeah, so I think that in terms of having like some kind of master document, what I found to be a little bit easier is to do the brunt of that, the vast majority of it, after you have done at least 1 or 2 drafts of the novel. So I touched on this a little bit already, but essentially it's easier to insert things and to clean things up than to do the alternative, which I think the more common thing people do is they will spend a bunch of time writing a 30-page essay on what their world is. Not that that's bad. Just that what this can create essentially is you're luring yourself into a corner. You're essentially making it so that all the decisions about your world and the backstory have already been figured out, and you have to constantly refer back to this document while you're drafting, which it can be a little tricky to do that. It can be a little maybe unnecessary in terms of the work. There's a weird balance to it because the nice thing about a lore letter is that you do a little bit of this. You don't do all of it, but you do some of it. And then when you're done with the book, then you can fill in the details. Then you can expand things. I forget if George R. R. Martin, when he did A World of Ice and Fire and Blood and like these textbooks, I think he said that like he had a lot of this stuff figured out, but he would change things. And he would also, reference things and then come up with more detail for them later. So that's all I'm really getting at, is that you don't have to have the whole world figured out, all the religions, all the languages. You can have like little nods to things. That can be super helpful. You can have things that make your world feel very detailed and lived in. But I just wouldn't, you just want to give yourself room to change things. And you don't want to have something so complicated that you're constantly changing things and you're losing track of like, oh, where did I decide on that again? Did I go with that backstory or did I change it? I don't know. So that's why like a show Bible, as Bridget's bringing up, can be helpful to really finalize and do most of the work on once you're done drafting, because then you're going to have a better idea of what the story actually is and how much world building information you do need at the onset. And in fact, if you still feel like, you know what, I do want to have this before I finish the first draft, that's totally valid too. What I would say is at the very, very least, at least wait until you have finished outlining. And not the typical kind of outline, but the one I've talked about in the past, which is a more sort of like planning process for the novel where you are looking at it in more of a macro way, where the story has a pitch and you have character dynamics figured out. And it's more of like a planning sort of outline. It needs a new name, honestly, so that people don't get it confused with like the typical outline where it's like in chapter 1, we do this. In chapter 2, we do this and all that. So Bridget also said, giving the purpose of a scene purpose is so key, and thinking about it in those words has never occurred to me before. Yeah, I think that it's something that as I was reading that comment, it really stuck out to me of like, this is good advice, but it's not complete advice. It's not perfect advice because it's so easy to mess that up and to essentially call it a day once you add a little bit of purpose to a scene. And yeah, it's one of those things that people will help you note or help you figure out if you get to the beta reader process, but you make your life even easier if you can figure out before you share the work with other people that, oh yeah, the purpose of the scene is kind of weak. It could be stronger. I could find other ways to add purpose and meaning to the scene that I didn't think of before, and just challenging yourself as you go. And so at that point, you're just going to have, I think, an easier time connecting the chapters together. And so it's not feeling like all the scenes sort of exist in a vacuum, if that makes sense. Bridget also said, world building is not meant to be included in the book. It's the foundation of a book, or any medium a story can come in. A stronger foundation is always better, but you don't always need to see the foundation of the house to know that it's there and it's stable. Yeah, and I think that, to be clear, it's like, yes, there will be world building in the book, but I think what Bridget's really saying is like a complicated world building history that reads like a textbook is not meant to be included in the book, which I totally agree with. And that's really what we're talking about, because you're going to have some exposition, you're going to have stuff like that. But that's why I gave the tip that you should try to really analyze how much exposition is paced throughout, especially the early chapters, because that's typically where most of the exposition comes in, because the reader doesn't know your world yet, and so you need to kind of slowly introduce them to things. And just being very careful about how much exposition and at which points are coming in, that's going to make it a lot easier for the reader to absorb your world and figure it out, and yeah, all that stuff. Bridget said, I agree that the dollar comparison is so subjective to the person writing it. I think the percentages gives a better understanding of how much each word eats up of the entire novel, at least for me. The money one I feel like only works if you also treat it like you have a budget. You have $100,000 to spend on this book, each word being $1. For me, I think the percentages makes more sense, but other people might have an easier time with a budget format. Yeah, I agree. Again, it's something where I think, Bridget and I are probably the same, and the percentages are a little bit easier. When I think of the dollar thing, I don't know. It just kind of stresses me out. I don't want to think about budgets, and I don't want to think of a book as a budget, but that's a personal thing. For some people, it just might be a better framework, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. Last thing, and Bridget might be annoyed with me for bringing this up, but they did mention, so when I send the audio to Bridget, I label it, of course, and I put FWFB, Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, and Bridget wrote unrelated, but seeing FWFB made my brain immediately go friends with fantasy benefits. So that is obviously I responded with JFC. I'm not going to tell you what that means for the youngins at home, but yeah. I absolutely 100% think that Friends with Fantasy Benefits needs to be another podcast that somebody needs to make, because that's a good idea for a podcast, I think. So yeah, all that to say, I think in terms of like the whole point of this episode and what I'm really getting at is try to spend your time wisely. Whether you're looking at it as budget or percentage or whatever, you're going to write a lot of stuff. You're going to write a lot of things. You want to write as little as you can that's not going to make it in. You want to spend your time wisely. You want to just be really careful with this stuff. You don't want to write a bunch of lore that's probably not going to make it into the book and that's it. Really, you have the secondary. So when you do write lore and you do kind of go through that exercise, the lore letter is nice because it has that secondary purpose. All I'm talking about is secondary purpose to things. You're not just writing lore, but you're also trying to discovery write. You're exploring the quirks about the character, the voice of the novel. It's a good exercise to do, and you're getting some lore on the page as well, even if you don't use all of it. And so it's all about efficiency. It's all about maximizing your time, because we all are very busy, and you don't want to spend all of your time trying to really just go back and start things over and get confused and get lost and disorganized. You want to treat this like it's something that is a process baked in organization, that is baked in really a plan, a strategy that's going to yield you the best success. I hate to talk about it in such clinical terms, I guess, because this is a creative process. It's an imaginative process, but yeah, you do have to balance the two if you want to up your chances of success. It really is that simple. I hate to make it sound like we're in some kind of freaking seminar, but I guess that's the case. This is, Friends with Fantasy Benefits, the seminar or something, I suppose. But all right, that's all for me. Thanks again to producer Bridget for providing the extra notes there. Thank you, of course, to our other producer, Natalia Emmons, for finding that prompt for me. And thank you to the person who wrote the prompt, Rare Looms. Really appreciate that as well. Gonna see you all on the next one and looking forward to it. So for the time being, be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.